Good evening. Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. For those of you who are here in person, and for those of you who are following our live stream online, thank you. My name is Aníbal Pérez Liñán, and I'm the director of the Kellogg Institute for International Studies. Welcome to our Global Democracy Conference. This conference, organized by the Kellogg Institute, is part of the broader democracy initiative at the University of Notre Dame, an initiative designed to defend and promote democratic principles through research, education, and the convening of multiple perspectives. I want to thank the many people who made this inaugural conference possible. Several colleagues who helped us define the themes of the conference, including Michael Kopech, Jamie Black, Andres Mejia, Benjamin García-Holgado, and Michael Camilleri. Many members of our advisory board who supported this project with ideas, feedback, and financial support. Many of you are here today, and I'm grateful, including the president of our board, Mary O'Connell. One member of the board, Bert Piedra, could not join us today, but he has supported this idea from its inception. And I want to offer a very special thanks to my colleagues at the Kellogg Institute who made the organization of this possible. Even though I am standing here today, this has been a team effort and a collective project. The Kellogg Institute has worked on the comparative study of democracy for more than 40 years, and it has an international reputation in this field. But this conference is for us, in many ways, a new experience. Over the past few years, we have seen many academic conferences that strive to understand the current crisis of democracy. The diagnostic is clear now. 4 decades ago, scholars here in the Kellogg Institute and many other places analyzed the conditions that made the transition from dictatorship to democracy possible. Today, scholars wonder how to prevent democracies from backsliding into dictatorship. We have seen how democratically elected governments exploit their democratic legitimacy to dismantle democratic institutions from within, in Nicaragua, as you will see later, in Venezuela, in Turkey, in Hungary, in India, in the Philippines, and in many other places. Most academic conferences and the excellent books written on this subject have underscored, in my view, a limitation of our universities. We employ our powerful analytical tools to identify the causes of the problem: polarization, inequality, populism, you name it. But we are less able to identify solutions or to inspire a course of action for democratic actors. Let me be clear on this point. I am not suggesting that scholars should think like practitioners or that we should insist on making superficial claims about the always elusive policy implications of our academic research. I am referring instead to a limitation of the social sciences that we need to understand and confront. This limitation, in my view, stems from the way in which we approach political questions, including democratic backsliding. Social scientists usually think of political behavior as the phenomenon to be explained, that is the dependent variable in the jargon of the trade, right? While practitioners think of political action as the driver of change, as the causal variable. Social scientists often focus on distal explanatory variables, such as historical legacies or macroeconomic conditions, over which political actors have very little control, while practitioners need to focus on actionable variables to address democratic backsliding now. And perhaps more importantly, at the root of those differences, social scientists seek to develop a precise understanding, a theory of the world. We assume that there is a stable order, an underlying mechanism driving the political process, a clockwork, if you wish, that we can unveil and understand. We even use this language, right? We say that we want to establish the causal mechanisms driving political outcomes. Now, for defenders of democracy, on the other hand, there is no clockwork, right? The world is fluid and contingent, and the machine or the mechanism, if it exists at all, it's out of warranty. The mechanisms for social transformation need to be built. This means in practice that it's often hard to establish a conversation between the two groups. Many of the problems that practitioners have in mind do not translate into neat research questions for us. And to many practitioners, the world of academic research is intriguing, exciting, sometimes intimidating, but often not helpful. This conference was created to take us beyond our comfort zones and to facilitate a conversation. We hope that Notre Dame will provide a space every year where practitioners and opinion leaders concerned with the future of democracy will join scholars to learn about the current academic debates and the most advanced research on this subject. We also hope that academics from Notre Dame and from other top research universities will find in this space an opportunity to engage with practitioners, rethink their research questions, and use their skills to address the urgent problems of today. We hope that together we will come up with new theories of change. The theme of our inaugural conference summarizes this vision. We want to understand the difficult world of today to shape a better world of tomorrow. This is our mission as our research university, and this is our calling. Thank you very much. But there is somebody who can speak with much more authority about our calling, and I am therefore happy to share with you the greetings of our colleague in the Political Science Department and the President-elect of the University of Notre Dame, Father Bob Dowd.
Welcome to the inaugural Global Democracy Conference. I'm Father Bob Dowd, Professor of Political Science and President-elect of the University of Notre Dame. Unfortunately, I cannot join you in person today, but I want to welcome all the participants to this conference. The future of democracy is a matter of concern across the world. In the region I study, Sub-Saharan Africa, crucial democratic gains in the 1990s and 2000s have receded as new strongmen and military regimes have come to power. In Eastern Europe, in South Asia, in Central America, and even in the United States, democratic forces confront new challenges that were unthinkable just 2 decades ago. The University of Notre Dame is committed to supporting principles of government that promote human dignity in line with our Catholic mission. Democracies have proven to be the most effective type of political regime to protect human rights and to secure citizen participation in public affairs. For this reason, Notre Dame has made the study of democracy one of its strategic priorities for the next decade. The newly created Democracy Initiative seeks to combine scholarship, education, and the convening of multiple voices, like the ones represented in this conference, to find solutions to the widespread crisis of democracy around the world. This initiative will facilitate scholarship that spans the globe, putting experts who focus on the United States in conversation with those who specialize in other nations. The Global Democracy Conference is an expression of this initiative. It builds on 4 decades of comparative research on democratization conducted at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies at the Keough School of Global Affairs. We hope that every year, academics and practitioners will convene at the Global Democracy Conference to engage in transformative conversations. For academics, this will be an opportunity to share their research with a broad audience and to identify new research questions by getting to know what's happening in everyday practice. For practitioners, it will be an opportunity to communicate research needs and practical findings from the field, acquire new conceptual perspectives, and discover potential partners in academia. Working on a long-standing tradition in the study of democracy through the Kellogg Institute, We want to make Notre Dame the convening place where researchers and policymakers meet regularly to discuss their findings and their challenges. I want to thank the organizers of this conference, our benefactors, and the participants who've traveled to Notre Dame. Have a wonderful conference, everybody.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Dr. Perez-Lignan, for the introduction. My name is Benjamin, and I was a student at the University of Notre Dame and a research scholar with the Kellogg Institute, but after yesterday, I've now joined a large group of Notre Dame alumni. Thank you. Thank you. During my time at the Kellogg Institute, I assisted Dr. Scott Mainwaring with his research on Latin America. I'll be working as one of 2 Global Democracy Fellows during this conference, along with Lujano Caballe, to facilitate the conference's work. Thank you very much to Holly Rivers for all the work that she's put into this conference and for allowing us the opportunity to enjoy this beautiful campus for a few more days. I have the utmost honor to introduce a very special, strong, and dedicated keynote speaker to you today. Hailing from Nicaragua, Dr. Juan Sebastián Chamorro worked multiple positions in the administration of President Bolaños and as General Director of the Millennium Account Program in Nicaragua, and as Executive Director of FUNIDES, the most important think tank of Nicaragua until it was closed by the Ortega regime. He participated in negotiations with the government of Nicaragua after the protests of 2018, and at the second round of negotiations in 2019 as coordinator of the Civic Alliance. In 2021, he registered as a candidate to the presidency of the Republic under Ciudadanos por la Libertad party. In June 8, 2021, he was arbitrarily detained in his house. After a trial with no witnesses other than police officers and without the possibility of a real defense, he was condemned to 13 years in prison on February 23, 2022. After almost 2 years in prison, he was released and banished from the country, stripped of his nationality, and his property confiscated. I want to take a moment, therefore, to acknowledge that Dr. Chamorro is an example of the real sacrifices of standing up for democratic values in your country. Holding a PhD in applied economics from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a master's degree in economics from Georgetown University, and a bachelor's degree in economics from the University of San Francisco, California, Dr. Chamorro is currently the Hewlett Visiting Fellow for Public Policy at the Kellogg Institute for International Studies here at the University of Notre Dame. As we have the privilege to hear him speak in a few moments, I want to express gratitude for the opportunity to bring students, scholars, and champions of democracy together at this conference. As we engage in rigorous intellectual discussion in the following days, I hope we remember that the cost of the ideas we debate in these spaces are borne by people with the courage to see them through, people like Dr. Chamorro. So, ladies and gentlemen, let's give him a warm welcome.
Thank you, Benjamin, and congratulations for this great achievement. Members of the board, Aníbal, Andrés, dear students, faculty, dear friends. It is an honor to be here talking to you about democracy for 2 reasons. First, because it's the inaugural Global Democracy Conference, and I am deeply honored to be here and being part of this new initiative of the University of Notre Dame. The university, through the Keough School and the Kellogg Institute, continues expanding the role as a world-leading institution analyzing extremely relevant issues of today. The second reason is that, as you will hear from my personal testimony, democracy means a lot to me. The defense of democracy and human rights is the reason why my family and I have suffered so much, including almost 2 years of my life in prison. I come from Latin America, a region where most countries are still functioning democracies, but at the same time, democracy has receded dramatically in some countries. After a hopeful wave of that eliminated military dictatorships in the continent, a counterwave has emerged from democracy itself. It is a wave that is dangerously advancing in some countries, while in others, like my own, Nicaragua, or Cuba, or Venezuela, are already submerged in the depths of autocracy. This year is historic for democracy, and elections in particular. Almost 100 countries and half the world's population is voting this year. While some are totally sham elections, like in Iran, it is important to note that millions and millions of individuals are going to face alone, with a pen, with a ballot, their decision to accept or reject a candidate. Although my following testimony is far from optimistic, I will emphasize at the end that democracy can be defended, can be protected, and promoted if right actions are to be done on time. Political participation, raising awareness, and denunciations of attacks against democracy should be done in real time and with energy. I will use the word autocrat several times. I define autocrat as a ruler who governs unconstrained, in the absence of or with limited checks and balances. Although mostly attributed to a particular person, I will refer to autocrat also as a group of people, like a junta or a political party. There is ample discussion in the academia and elsewhere about the challenges democracies are facing today. There are concerns about the possibility of a wave of autocratization, especially if we analyze the regression in terms of the world's population share now living under authoritarian regimes. It is a fact that countries are falling into autocracies, the prelude to tyranny. According to Freedom House, in its global report for 2023, democracy receded for the 20th consecutive year. 29 countries suffered a downgrading in their democratic scores, particularly in countries in Central Asia, which have become even more repressive. VDEM, in its annual report for 2024, states that the level of democracy enjoyed by the average person worldwide in 2023 is down to levels last seen in 1985. Autocrats have improved their techniques in achieving control. 50 years ago, it was more brutal. Military coup plotters violently closed TV stations, stormed parliaments, or even exiled or assassinated democratically elected presidents. Today, autocrats achieve similar results without too much turmoil. Autocrats use the democratic system in their efforts to attain power and weaken democracy. Dictators seldom share their plans. They reluctantly accept democratic rules because it is the only way to get to power. Once in power, many autocrats show their real nature. They bring with them, usually into the executive branch or parliament, the virus of autocracy. This virus spread rapidly to other branches of government. It is a silent disease at the beginning. Osram Varol from Iowa has documented this phenomenon across regions and explains the expansion of stealth autocracies in regions and countries, including the United States. The early symptoms of this silent disease are usually dismissed. But once it has reached the entire body, it is usually too late to stop it. Democratic backsliding is the overall result of this disease. It is important to note that over time, voters tend to forget history, and previous autocrats can present themselves as Democrats, alluding to new voters prone to believe in promises. Political scientists like Scott Mainwaring have documented that authoritarian successor parties have been effective in their efforts to return to power, especially in former communist countries. Rachel Reel from Northwestern University has also explored the issue in the African context. Usually in the possession of a political brand, these parties maintain control of territorial organizations, as well as significant sources of income, which in turn allow them to control networks of support. Many of these parties have maintained intelligence services, an important source of information for the political leader. This implies that when competing with democratic parties, former authoritarian successor parties run with a great advantage. Once in power, autocrats tend to bend existing rules and change those rules in their favors. Laws are reformed, re-election clauses are redrafted to ensure permanence in power. Laws determining what constitutes defamation are usually reformed to attack independent media. The attacks also take the form of fiscal pressures, exerting accusations of tax evasions and fraud. In the old days, dictators used censorship to silence newspapers. Today, they extinguish them by imposing tax burden and using judicial system to imprison editors or impose huge monetary fines. The autocrat usually counterattacks independent press with state-owned outlets or social media. Then, autocrats focus and attack and target key government positions. The Supreme Court, judges, the prosecutor general, the general controller, and human rights prosecutors. Offices designed to be occupied by respected lawyers are replaced by autocrat-friendly individuals and politicians who accept the position with the compromise of not accusing the leader. Opposition leaders are the natural targets of autocrats. They pose a real competition, and the autocrat's objective is to get rid of them. An old dictator used to say that there were three mechanisms to get rid of an opponent, in the following order: money, stick, and bullet. Money for the easily convinced, stick for the indifferent, and bullet for the hardliners. There's no dictatorship that has not implemented in one way or another this troika of repression. In the past, the military played a fundamental role in placing a dictator, sometimes coming from their own ranks. Today, armed forces are used by autocrats to maintain and consolidate their own power. What do they gain by doing that? Retired generals often fill government positions. Companies owned by generals, army officers get government contracts. That means that the army is secure by the force of money. This explains the military obedience in countries like Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. Local municipal governments. The autocrats must have absolute control of what is going on in municipalities, either by prohibiting or manipulating local elections. Laws redefining districts, like recently in El Salvador, are used to move boundaries of the municipalities, so local elections can be more favorable. The work of NGOs is uncomfortable for government, even democratic ones. They play an important role in demanding government transparency, in demanding accountability and policy impact. The usual attack by autocrats is that NGOs respond to foreign powers who want to interfere with domestic affairs. They are shut down. In my country, there are basically no NGOs, as the dictator Ortega eliminated more than 3,000 NGOs, including the Red Cross and the Boy Scouts. The list of targets goes on to include religious leaders, opinion makers, influencers, celebrities, and sports legends. They are usually utilized by the regime for propaganda. If they criticize, they can go to jail. So, what is it like to live under a dictatorship? In my country, dictatorships are more the norm than the exception. Just to illustrate my point here with a personal example. My father, born in 1932, lived most of his life under the Somoza dictatorship, which lasted from 1936 to 1979. And he died during Ortega's current and second dictatorship. My uncle, who never voted, spent almost 5 years of his life in prison and was assassinated during the Somoza regime. My grandfather grew up during the Zelaya dictatorship from 1893 to 1909, suffered exile, and died during Somoza's dynasty. And my great-grandfather died from complications after being in prison for years by Zelaya. In the last 130 years, there has been 89 years under dictatorship and still counting. 4 generations under 3 different dictatorships. As you can see, in my family, we don't get along with dictators. In 2018, Daniel Ortega reformed Social Security, and a wave of protests erupted around the country. Initiated by the elderly, it was followed by university students, and then everyone followed. Ortega responded with bullets, killing more than 350 people and injuring thousands. Let me share with you some stories and feelings after the 2018 crisis that I have witnessed from people that I know. Imagine the feeling and the suffering of the father of Taylor Lorio, a 9-month-old baby who was shot in the head while in his father's arm and not being able to seek justice. He had to leave the country under the pressure of the police and came to the United States and now works in Florida at a hardware store. Alvaro Conrado, 15-year-old, shot in the chest and desperately taken to 2 public hospitals while the government denied medical attention because he was providing water to the protesters. When Alvaro's mother traveled to the United Nations Human Rights Council to denounce the crime, the regime prohibited her entry back into the country, leaving her family, her house, everything behind. Franco Valdivia, a 21-year-old college student whose body had to be exhumed weeks after his funeral to determine that he was shot by a sniper with a high-caliber rifle. I met hundreds of students whose academic records were erased, some of them in their last semester of college. They could not enjoy the graduations like the one that we saw this weekend. Colleges, by the way, that were violently confiscated by the government. Even social media is monitored 24/7 by government officials who can arrest anyone and condemn up to 8 years in prison for violating a new cyber attack law. Even waving the national flag in public in my country is enough evidence to put you in prison. I have colleagues of the opposition whose house has been burned to the ground and their family businesses of generations confiscated. I could not stay indifferent to the repression that I just described. I became a politician, a human rights defender, and a presidential candidate. As a consequence, I suffered intimidation and multiple death threats on my phone. For more than 8 months, I was under police harassment, being followed wherever I went, and sometimes forced me to illegal house arrest and prohibition to mobilize inside the country. I suffered beatings several times and false accusations. I was arbitrarily detained at night from my house in front of my family, and I was incommunicado for 6 months while in prison. The regime put me on trial without due process and denied me of a proper legal defense. I was accused of treason and sentenced to 13 years in prison. This sentence caused extreme pain to my family, my wife, and my daughter, present here, who imagined that they would not see me until 2035. I spent almost 2 years unable to see them in person. While in prison, I was subject to degraded treatment, isolation, harassment, and denial of the right to practice my religion. I was banished from my country, stripped of my nationality and my properties. The current Nicaraguan regime has violated, just in my case, 20 out of the 30 rights guaranteed under the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It is because of this terrible suffering, myself and my family, that my commitment to democracy and human rights are stronger than ever. I knew I was going to be arrested. I even prepared a video in anticipation. I had the chance to escape from the arrest, but I refused. I decided not to resist my detention, but to continue my fight in prison, despite the fear that I clearly felt. For 3 months, incommunicado in prison, I suffered a lot by leaving my family behind. The torture of not knowing anything about them made me think a lot whether I have made the right decision. Hope in the future and the love for my family kept me strong. Discipline and prayer allow me to live one day at a time, 611 days to be exact. So, what can we do to prevent these things from happening? There are 2 basic elements about democracy that I think are not well understood. The first is that sometimes voters, even intellectuals, tend to see democracy as an abstract concept, disconnected from material outcomes. Autocrats sometimes stress about concrete problems people face: security, inflation, unemployment, all that at the cost of democracy and especially freedoms. At the end, however, the erosion of democracy has material effects on people's lives, like my own, and millions who suffer from oppression around the world. The second is that democracy and rights in particular cannot be isolated, cannot be analyzed in isolation. That is, we should never see the violations of rights elsewhere as their problem. As Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said when asked why he was in Birmingham, he said, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." And I would expand this to the time dimension. Injustice anytime is a threat to justice every time. The 2 misconceptions about democracy, one that is abstract and isolated in nature, has led to many people turn their backs against incredible suffering around the world. This indifference can sometimes do more harm to democracy than autocrats themselves. As Dr. King wrote, "Shallow understanding from people of goodwill is more frustrating than absolute misunderstanding from people of ill will." That is why I think this global conference on democracy, understanding today, shaping tomorrow, is a good step towards having a better understanding of democracy. Thinking about what to do is important to keep in mind that by design it takes a huge amount of people, in fact the majority of society, to get a leader elected. On the other hand, it takes an incredible small amount of people to maintain an autocrat in power. This issue takes to another important element, which is the role of power elites, or elites in general. Elites play a fundamental role in the destiny of a nation. I will refer here to elite without any connotation, but to define the group in society that had a leading role in economics, in politics, intellectual creation, public opinion, and social movements. I had the opportunity of seeing how political power, policies, and democratic consolidation or backsliding are determined at the top, a perspective clearly explained by many scholars. If politics is shaped by elites, by immature democracies, more so in developing democracies, where weak institutions, exclusions, injustice, and inequality are usually the norm, not the exception. Policies in general are administered by a group of people. Elites composed of individuals capable of generating and lobby for laws, policies, and action that put in motion a project called nation. Elites can be positive, putting aside specific interest in favor of development, or can betray the mandate of the people and work for specific interests. Elites can be helpful when the nation project they promote is intended to serve the interests of the general population without exclusion. It takes vision and courage for elites not to fall into the temptation of ruling just for their own interests. With respect to inclusive institutions, Robinson and Acemoglu in their book, Why Nations Fail, point out that the development and flourishing of nations resides in the creation and endurance of inclusive institutions. These institutions must fulfill 5 criteria. First, they have to establish clear rules and a level field. Second, there should not be any bias against any particular group. Third, institutions must provide public goods needed for societies to develop. Fourth, to potentialize freedom to select their destinies. And fifth, property rights. I see democratic backsliding as an attempt of an elite or an individual to consolidate its political power at the expense of another group. They violate, therefore, the first and second conditions of the 5 exposed by Robinson and Acemoglu. The result of this are felt in the violation of rights of those excluded, public goods converted into goodies for enablers, lack of freedom for people to select their own destiny, and the violation of property rights. We're here at this inaugural Global Democracy Conference, which will surely start a new tradition at Notre Dame in analyzing democracy's contemporary challenges and achievements. At the Keough School and the Kellogg Institute, institutions focus on policies, there has been an emphasis to build a bridge, as Aníbal was mentioning, between solid academic research and good policy recommendations. That is, bringing solutions to emerging challenges through solid academic understanding. The idea of this conference is to convene academia with practitioners, thinkers, doers, and policymakers on how to protect, defend, and promote democratic values. For practitioners in the international justice system present here, international justice has progressed significantly in the last decades, but it is far from having the enforcement mechanism within countries to stop autocrats. For practitioners in the international financial institutions, development organizations should pay more attention and demand more accountability on countries that are moving backwards with respect to democracy. Countries promoting freedom, democracy, free press, and free markets should be awarded, and countries doing the opposite should be reprimanded. For academics, it is often said that democracies tend to better allocate resources, often in the form of more and better public goods at the service of the general population. More effort should be devoted to analyzing this question empirically, so we move from the abstract discussion of democracy to a more real conversation. Historians in particular have an extremely challenging problem in the age of rapid communication. History is easily manipulated and distorted by autocrats who want to construct a new version of history. As Mark Twain said, a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes. Political scientists, including some colleagues here at Kellogg, are drawing attention to subnational political processes, elections in states and municipalities. It is important, as sometimes existing local rules prevent the erosion of democracy. To understand how those rules exist over time can shed light in recommendation at a more general and national level. Monetary transfer public programs should be evaluated in detail and assess how these mechanisms help families and correct exclusions. NGOs with international presence can play an extremely important role, not only in supporting its local counterparts, but also in alerting the world of silent, sometimes camouflage actions to restrict their important and vital role in society. This is not an exhaustive list of recommendations, but some thoughts derived from my own experience. An experience I hope is found useful for those who deeply worry about democracy in the world, like myself. We must be vigilant with respect to this political system that, despite its imperfections, has proven to be the best one yet. A final thought that I think is fundamental. In addition to all efforts we may do in defending it, democracy's greatest ally, democracy's greatest force lies in the heart of the individual, in the desire for freedom that derives from our own instincts. Autocrats try to assault the minds and hearts of its citizens, but a person pretending to rule in perpetuity can never repress the desire of the people to be free. And that is why they are afraid of their own people. We should exploit that fear into our advantage, giving strength, motivation, and power of the human will and the natural desire to be free. Again, I congratulate the university, the Keough School, the Kellogg Institute for this initiative, and thank you for giving me the privilege of being here with you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
We have some time. We have a reception waiting, but we have some time for questions, and I'm sure many people will have questions for you, Juan Sebastián. Thank you so much for this very moving presentation and very personal presentation, but also very, very rich. For people who are following us online through the live stream, you are able to send questions if you like, so please feel free to do so. And while people here in the audience also think about their questions, let me take advantage of my position to start with the first one. You had this very interesting line in your presentation, which was this idea that it takes a majority of people to elect an autocrat to power and a small number of people to keep the autocrat in power, right? Which I think is a very insightful point. But you also pointed out that people sometimes elect autocrats to power because they seem to forget the experience of dictatorship, right? And I think that generationally, this seems to be true. From Ghana to Brazil, right? There is a generation or two of people that have not experienced dictatorship, so now they are less sensitive to this issue. But there is another side of this issue that I wanted to ask you about, which is sometimes these potential autocrats or wannabes are very explicit about what they intend to do, right? Sometimes they seem to be deceiving people, but sometimes they have been already in power. People know them. So people knew Ortega, people knew Viktor Orban, right? And there are many situations, and people know many candidates, right, in the world. And so, who have been in power and who we have experienced them, we know what they mean. So, is your sense that these candidates deceive their voters, or is it that voters hear what they want to hear? What's your sense about this problem?
Well, I think in general terms, they play with illusions. Daniel Ortega came to power with the illusion of providing a solution to back then there was a huge energy crisis, and he said that he was going to solve it with the money of Hugo Chavez, and people were just fed up with the blackouts that would last like 7-8 hours per day. So people, especially young voters who were born after 1990 when Ortega lost the first elections, they didn't know exactly the nature of Ortega. The independent voters play a fundamental role in Latin American countries. Nicaragua is not an exception. So they tend to allure this to this mass of voters with promises. And I was really surprised to see that there was an ample literature in investigating this with the successor repressive, autocratic political parties that came to power again, because they also, and this is the other element which I wanted to point it out, they tend to distort history and change history to their favor, reinvent national history, and that's why one of the recommendations, the huge role of historians to put the records right in the face of Facebook. That sometimes you might follow someone with the same or even more attention than to a scholar analyzing the issue. Now, this other idea of this small group of people maintaining power, maintaining the autocrat in power, an idea explored by the Mesquita that we talk about in the Dictator's Handbook, I found it extremely enlightening in analyzing the context that I actually saw. Ortega is extremely unpopular, and but he maintains his control through the army and the police. Other autocrats in the making tend to be popular by their own right. The levels of popularity of Bukele, for example, are an envy to any politician in the world, right? Very high. So that's kind of I see that popularity as a caution to help them to justify changes and they make and people buy that argument. For some reason, many people have changed their opinion about the state of the economy in El Salvador in the last 10 years. Like 8 points in the Latino Barometro survey. They think the economy is doing better when in fact it just grew at 1% last year. So this thing about public opinion also is extremely important for autocrats. They do care to send the right message and touch the hearts of the people about their everyday problems, and and say, I'm here to solve the problems for you. I'm a leader that worries about what's happening to your family.
Thank you. Let's see if some of you have questions. Oliver, Anna will pass the microphone. Oliver, if you could introduce yourself.
Thank you so much for this powerful account. I remember I was in Nicaragua 5 years ago, and one could feel that people were unwilling to speak freely, and people warned us that we were being followed around. So this is very moving to hear your experience. My question is that for years and years, and I'm coming from Brazil. My name is Oliver Stunkel. I'm a professor at the Fundação Getúlio Vargas in São Paulo. For many years, we believed that mediocre growth, the lack of economic opportunity, was one of the major risks to democracy. So people elected a dictator or somebody who posed a risk to democracy because they believed that their economic realities could improve. However, now we see a lot of countries that are doing exceptionally well economically, and they are at risk. Hungary, India, the United States. those aren't people who vote potentially for somebody who is a risk to democracy because they think they're economically much better off necessarily. So we see solid growth and risk to democracy, which is very different from what we saw before. What do you think is going on there? Is this about, you know, people feeling second-class citizens or identity issues, fear of globalization? Do you think there's something more than just the quest for more economic rights? How do you think about that? Thank you.
I think, Oliver, that the fundamental point here, which applies not only to autocrats, it applies to politicians in general, but autocrats are experts in doing a better job. It's connecting real solutions to real problems suffered by the people. Bukele, security. Ortega, energy. Milei, inflation. Things that are very close to the pockets and the minds of the people. People don't see the economy, they see the economy as something too abstract, but when they see the prices going up or a kid being killed in the streets in front of the family, and you got a guy who offers solutions to that, you tend to vote for that person. So I will answer that they are good at reading what the public sentiment is, what are the fundamental issues, but not in an abstract sense. And that's a problem that we Democrats face because democracy, and this is something that I wanted to stress with my own example, we defended democracy and we pay a high cost of that, is that democracy should not be presented as an abstract concept, but something that affects or benefits the people in general. But to answer your specific question, is a fundamental issue that the society is facing: crime, unemployment, inflation, that touches the heart and mind. Again, not necessarily applied to autocrats, but they tend to present as a savior of the problem. And Bukele is a good example of someone who actually delivered, with the violation, obviously, of human rights. Thousands of people, 40,000 people, being in prison, some of them without due process. So you know, people see, the streets are safer and the bad guys are in jail. So he's providing a solution. Now, economically speaking, that's another issue. The economy is not moving faster in El Salvador, and the explanation, which I never heard before, is that from an economic point of view, is that the president have taken so many people out of prison that their economic activity actually depressed the economy, which doesn't make much of a sense. But yeah, it's a fundamental problem that people face in the families.
Let's take a couple of questions. Benjamin. You have introduced yourself. So
Thank you. Yes,
yeah,
thank you.
Skip that part.
So sort of on the same theme that we've been discussing on why voters vote for authoritarian parties or candidates, whether it's for reasons of security or the economy, I'm curious what your thoughts are on the role of political parties in the opposition to craft messages that are palatable to voters, to be able to either see that or provide alternative policy solutions. The example of Bukele is a really good one, but also in the United States and Hungary and other places. How do opposition parties that are committed to democracies, how do they successfully woo voters back? What examples have we seen of that?
Do you want to take one more? Yeah, let's do one more.
Thank you. I'm Sylvia Pedraza, professor of sociology at the University of Michigan. And I drove to hear you talk. And I'm not disappointed. It was a very, very excellent talk. Like you, I come from Cuba, you come from Nicaragua. There's a lot of similarities. And I won't detail them because you know them, and people here, I think, also know a lot of it. But when I was doing research on the Cuban Revolution, I came across a book that I found very helpful by Tomás Flores and Irfan Nuruddin, I think. I'm very bad with names. And what they talk about there is they have a concept of a democratic stock, that some countries have very deep democratic stocks and some countries have very shallow democratic stocks. Cuba, like Nicaragua, has a very shallow democratic stock because, you know, it's not just the 65 years of the Cuban Revolution without democracy. It's also all the way back. The figure that you gave about Nicaragua is really telling, you know, how many years of dictatorships Nicaraguans have actually lived through. And in contrast to a place like Venezuela, which has a very deep democratic stock, actually, although right now they have an autocratic regime. But, you know, Venezuela was democratic for many, many years, so they have a deep democratic stock. So I imagine that in the future, it will be a lot easier for Venezuela to become democratic again, and very difficult for Cuba and for Nicaragua. So I just want you to comment on that.
Thank you. I think I will relate the two questions because the cause of this catastrophe in Venezuela is derived from the feeling of the people about the political parties. Going back to your question, Benjamin, also, there's a sense that political parties are used by politicians just to get rich. And there's, I would say that political parties are in crisis in Latin America, without questions. The search of these leaders are coming from movements. Even some of them are very created in the context of the elections. So I think, and in addition to that, if you include if you add the caudillo sentiment behind that, and Venezuela has been a country of strong leaders, starting from Gomez, Pérez Jiménez, Chavez himself. So you got a culture of caudillo that is very strong in many, many, many countries. Probably Cuba is a good example. So, but sometimes accidents happen. Costa Rica had a very strong caudillo, Pepe Figueres. He was in the middle of a civil war, and they decided to sign a peace agreement. They decided to bury the weapons, literally put the weapons on the ground. They were used in Nicaragua, by the way, 40 years after, to overthrow Somoza. But the agreement was there, okay, we're gonna keep the arms in a safe place, and if we needed to use it, we're gonna use it if necessary. They abolished the army, and it's now one of the healthiest democracies. So this is a counterexample of how caudillos and elites can play a fundamental role if they have a vision of the country. And at the end, eliminating the army allowed the Costa Rican state to dedicate huge amount of resources to education, which in turn created a whole dynamic there. So sometimes it takes vision, courage, and accidents like the civil war in Costa Rica. But definitely I will say that, and I'm being asked all the time about political parties, that young people should enter into politics, and this applies to the United States as well, because that's the only way. I mean, political parties exist for a reason. They probably are not good used in many places, or abused, but the purpose of the existence of political parties has to be understood by young people to participate and try to bring change from within. The outcome of many countries had to do, again, as I say, by historical accidents, leaders with some vision, but it's a very complex process in development, you know. And that's why I wanted to mention the book, Why Nations Fail, because from an historical perspective, it shows some turning points in certain societies that play a fundamental role. The Civil War in England, the US independence, and many other examples where elites actually play a role in creating institutions that were inclusive and promoted participation, especially eliminated exclusion of groups and trade, with the imperfections, obviously, that you will see in any political process, but the good examples of countries that have been successful in development lies in strong institutions, particularly the rule of law.
Do you want to address Benjamin's question?
Well, yes, I think I kind of related Benjamin's question to the role of political parties, and my message would be for young people to actually participate in political structure and reform the political parties from within, because they exist for a reason. I don't know if that answered Benjamin.
Yeah, I think it was more like how do political parties themselves craft messages that are successful, counterparts to whatever the authoritarian message is. So the main one's about inflation or security, and voters are happy with that authoritarian regime. How do opposition parties mobilize voters against that? I guess that's like the challenge that's what we see.
Well, connect with the people, connect with the people's problem, and and we're seeing in the context of the elections in Venezuela right now, which I don't know what the result will be. I want to be optimistic on that in that country, but we'll see. Maria Corina and Edmundo has been very, approaching to people and saying, there is hope, there will be change, and that's something that actually worked out very well for Violeta Chamorro in my country, that she promised the elimination of the military service and reduction of inflation, and especially the end of war. So people actually saw that material thing happening to them.
I think Tara has a question, and then Kurt Whalen in the back, too.
Thank you, Ana, and thank you, Juan Sebastián, for coming to Notre Dame, for giving us your daughter, and for giving us hope. I want to actually turn to sort of the external forces and some of the threats to democracy from the PRC, and in particular Russia. I attended last week a seminar that was put on by the Wilson Institute with the director of the U.S. Southern Command, General Laura Richardson. You may have met with her. And she was very alarming in terms of the Russian influence in Nicaragua today, in terms of the military training that's going on in your country and the potential for spillover. And we've seen what happened with Wagner in the Sahel and in Africa, and I'm just wondering if you might comment in terms of what you're hearing on the ground in terms of that potential threat.
Okay, yeah, let's go to that.
So I have a question for you as an opposition politician, which is, there's a big dilemma when an autocrat like Ortega has committed grievous human rights violations. The international community wants to prosecute the guy, right? But that threat of prosecution gives him an incentive to hang on for dear life, and his henchmen also support him. So as an opposition politician, is there any way out of this dilemma? Because the Venezuelan opposition faced the same thing. Do you give the guy a guarantee of amnesty? How do you persuade somebody who has committed all these human rights violations to step down at the risk of losing power and being prosecuted?
Well, with the Russian question first, definitely there is a lot of influence of Russia in Nicaragua. Ortega is implementing several actions to please Putin. Patrushev was 5 weeks ago in Nicaragua, and they actually signed an agreement between the Russian Federation and the Nicaraguan government to give more support to this training facility. When I was in prison, one of the officers told me proudly that he had been trained by the Russians in interrogation techniques. And from what I could tell, the techniques were not that good enough, but they were helping. But they were very proud, and he was showing me a medal and all that. So this is something that they don't do in the hiding, and that's what the general was referring to. In a more general context, there's so many things that Putin has created and has been distributed all over the world. The cyber attack law that I just mentioned, the attacks against NGOs, the pressure against the media, opposition leaders. There's this ecosystem of autocrats, they share a lot of technologies. And that's why the general was really alarmed because this is a country that is 2 hours away from Miami, where she is. So, so just last week, the State Department issued a sanction against this particular training facility. Obviously, these officers are not, they don't have bank accounts in the US or anything like that. The sanction in itself will have a very little effect in terms of what they do inside Nicaragua. But it's a political message of saying, you know, we have you watch, and if, for example, the Mexican army or the Mexican police wants to get trained in that particular facility, they have to be aware that they can get in trouble with the sanctions. So, so I think that was a very smart move of attacking the repressive capacity of Ortega by not hurting the general population in the process. Now, going back to the question, this is the dilemma that we all face as opposition members everywhere. On one side, you cannot turn a blind eye on the violation of human rights. There must be justice. Guilty people should be put on trial eventually. Because if you don't do that, they will stay doing what they do for years. And I always say, you know, the current crisis in Haiti is a result of the gang members fighting each other. It was the creation of the Tonton Macoutes generations ago by Duvalier. So when you keep impunity alive, you tend to keep the issue behind, and then it will pop up sometime later. On the other hand, you have to give, especially those surrounding what in the dictator's handbook is called the essential behind the dictator. You want to bring to them a ladder that they will step down and abandon the dictator in order to break this coalition that supports the. So it takes a lot of political. You have to be very mature in terms of in politics, because you want to approach them in a way saying, you know, if you did not commit any human rights violation, you will have a space in the new Venezuela, new Nicaragua. But on the other hand, you're sending the opposite message to a guy who killed a mother or a student. You have to tell them, you know, be prepared. But you wanna differentiate the bad guys from the good guys, and this is extremely difficult. We in Nicaragua have failed in sending a positive, optimistic message to the people supporting the Sandinistas because of all the repression. So it's not politically correct to extend the hand to a Sandinista collaborator, even though, you know, if they didn't do any crime. It's not seen as a strong enough, so to speak, for an opposition member. But you have to do it, because at the end, all these problems are solved in a negotiation table, and that's what you have to aim at.
I think we have time for a couple of more questions. Maria Isabel Puerta had a question there. And
thank you so much. I had a question about Russia, but I think I'm going to rephrase it. I was thinking, Ortega needs someone like Chavez to help him out in terms of the economy. Putin is not that person. What does Putin really provide Ortega? Is it insurance against what the US could? I don't know if there is a policy in terms of negotiating. I think it was today that he ordered his brother to be detained, taken away. So Putin can provide some leverage, but just like you said, it's really difficult for them to leave power. They violated human rights, Maduro, Ortega. They can't negotiate their way out. They know they have no choice. So is it the same cover that Putin provides Maduro, Diaz-Canel? It's just some sort of protection against what the U.S. and others, and I'm not talking about sanctions. This goes beyond sanctions. So what is it really that Putin is providing? Because it's not, their economy is not in condition to give them more than that. That sense of, you know, we're supporting the military, or technology that I believe it's more China than Russia. Russia doesn't have right now the financial situation to help them out. So what is it really that they are providing, the Kremlin and
Sure.
Putin? Thank you.
Let's take one more question.
Thank you so much. So I'm a practitioner, and I think a lot in terms of theories of change. What levers can we sort of push in order to, you know, foster democracy, defend democracy? And you've mentioned elites a lot today. I try to understand why I happen to think that the decisions elites make are crucial for democracy, and therefore I try to understand why they make the decisions that they make. So given that you're an opposition leader, I would ask you, and you have described this many times today, like you bear a huge cost. You know, you were imprisoned, you chose to be imprisoned in a way, and you know, these had concrete consequences. So I would ask you, why were you willing to bear these consequences in the defense of democracy? I would personally be scared, and I'm sure a lot of people would, including other opposition leaders. So why were you willing to make that decision?
To the Russia question, we have to understand that dictators like Ortega seek more than just material benefits. He has declared himself from the beginning of the Sandinista movement in 1969 that the enemy of the movement was the United States. So he keeps this idea of attacking politically the U.S., and obviously Russia is an ally. And the Russians are extremely happy with that, because they do have someone within the neighborhood doing problems for the U.S. 2 days ago, a plane from Tripoli, Libya, landed with 356 citizens of India, landed legally in Managua, and these people were transported by the people of the state of Nicaragua into the border of Honduras with the intention of continue their travel to the U.S. Ortega is charging a huge amount of money to these people to do that, but he's not doing it for the money. He's doing it because he knows that migration is a political issue, and his interest is to destabilize politically and taking advantage of these people that are, you know, looking for a new horizon and come to the United States. There are material things that Putin can send. And Nicaragua is a very small country, and if you go to the cities of Managua, public transportations are Russian buses. In fact, the bus that took me from the prison to the airport was Russian. So they can get small stuff for Russian standards. Wheat, also for production of bread, is usually donated by Russia, and tanks. All the old tanks from the World War II, and many of them ended up in Nicaragua, T-55 tanks that are completely obsolete, and now we have the largest tank arsenal in the country, with a country in the south that doesn't have an army. So again, because I always say that the military always love these toys, you know, they have tanks, and it's nice to have tanks. Now, in terms of the economy is doing relatively well because 700,000 people have migrated since the crisis erupted. This is something that I forgot to mention in my presentation. This is about 12% of the population. US, Costa Rica, and Spain. They're sending a huge amount of money to the economy. 15 years ago, as a percentage of GDP, remittances were about 10 to 12%. Now it is 28%. So it's completely dependent on remittances. The economy is growing, consumption is increasing, and this is something created by himself. He actually promoted the exile of hundreds of thousands of people, and they're sending the remittances. So that's something that brings some material into their hands. And also he is negotiating with the Chinese a free trade agreement and a set of infrastructure. We are kind of coming late because we had a relationship with Taiwan until Ortega was able to get the last drop of the Taiwanese in the form of a baseball stadium. And then he finished the relationship with Taiwan and started with the Chinese, and now they're promising airports, ports, roads, trains, and so on. So they're aiming at gaining from the Chinese some resources. Theory of change. Every person has a different reason. In my case, in particularly, I always liked politics and public service. Vicky never liked the idea of getting involved in politics. We saw that as a retirement project. Retirement came a little bit earlier, and but all the suffering, all the killings that we saw put us into this path of defending democracy. There was a lot of optimism in 2018, I have to admit, false optimism that Ortega was going to step down. So we were kind of very happy. Hundreds of thousands of people marching in the streets of Managua. Oliver mentioned that. But then he started to repress and kill people in each and single march. So every time that we convene or we call for a march in the city of Managua, someone was going to get killed. So we decided to stop calling for the marches because we were putting people at risk. So that's how we started. Then we started with very small groups of protesters, piquetes, I would say, and then they will surround the buildings and all that. So he killed the entire possibility of protest, even the waving the national flag. And now only there's a guy who used to be the chief of the army during the 80s and happens to be Daniel Ortega's brother. And he wrote an article in an Argentine media outlet last Sunday saying that, well, that's yesterday, saying that his wife is not apt for succession. So the guy put his own brother into house arrest. So that's the kind of repression that we're talking about. Nobody is immune to repression in Ortega's Nicaragua.
Juan Sebastián, thank you for opening our conference. I'm sure people have many, many questions still, but I would like to invite you to join us for a reception and continue this conversation.